Things went along swimmingly in Cyprus up until about the 7th or 8th century, when there were a series of very difficult, very powerful Arab raids along the coast. Most of the cities were devastated. In fact, Salamis was practically completely destroyed and had to be replaced by a new city, Famagusta, which is just a little bit to the south. But the point is, Cyprus was in big trouble because it was largely undefended. The Byzantines realized that, and initially their response had to be naval. The Arab navies had to be crushed in order to protect Cyprus and, for that matter, Byzantium. And the Byzantine answer was Greek fire. Greek fire destroyed the Arab navies to a fairly large extent, and the armies were reorganized along modernized lines. And the most important thing, for as far as Cyprus is concerned, is that the fortifications were vastly upgraded. In addition, the capital was moved inland to Nicosia, where it still is today. Back in those days, in the earliest Byzantine days, the fortifications of Nicosia were rudimentary, basically just a blockhouse with fortifications. But curtain walls came up pretty quickly around the cities. After beating back the Arabs, the Turks turned on Byzantium, and Byzantium found itself short of everything except the enemy.
It's 1095. The Turks have established their capital only 100 miles from Constantinople. The Emperor Alexius has decided he needs some help from his brother Christians in the West. So he's sending a letter to the Pope asking for help. On the face of it, a perfectly reasonable proposition. Actually, Alexius cannot even begin to imagine the effect this letter will have. This letter was going to blow the world apart. Alexius ruled the Byzantine Church, and he assumed the Pope would act like a Byzantine official, organizing the recruitment of a few paid professional soldiers. This was a mistake.
The First Crusade turned out to be remarkably effective. It did liberate Jerusalem and a substantial portion of the Middle East leading up to Jerusalem. And the result was that the Latin knights founded various kingdoms and counties and such, and set up an order that looked very much like things did in Europe. The result is that you have a prince of Antioch, a count of Edessa, a count of Tripoli, and there's a king of Jerusalem now. This lasted for some time, but eventually the Arab forces found their ground, and they started a counterattack. The Crusader army was destroyed, and Jerusalem was lost. But not all of the Crusader kingdoms or counties fell into Arab hands. A second crusade was called to liberate Jerusalem, but this was largely a failure, and that led to the call for the Third Crusade. This one was substantially different from any crusade that had gone before, because unlike before, this time the crusade was led and financed by kings. The King of France, the King of England, and the Holy Roman Emperor were all involved. And the most important one, the one that we see the most of, is King Richard. He makes the Third Crusade what we think of today as the Crusades. That big block of stone behind me is Limassol Castle, and it's been rebuilt several times. So it's not the story. But there is a great story about what happened here. You see, The Third Crusade kicked off, and Richard's army was headed for Jerusalem. And they went mostly by ship. and Unlike most of the people that were crusaders, of course, Richard brought a substantial portion of his family with him, his mother, sister, and his fiancée. And they were separated in a storm, and the fiancée was shipwrecked on Cyprus. The person who was in charge of Cyprus, his name was Komnenos, which is the imperial family name, and he called himself the Byzantine emperor in Cyprus. But when the fiancée requested help, he did not provide it. That was a big mistake. Richard landed with his army, and he taught the emperor of Cyprus the error of his ways by defeating him several different times and taking possession of the entire island. This is the only location where there is an English royal wedding outside of England. Richard was married to Beringa, his fiancée, here at Limassol Castle. You can't really tell what this is very well from the photograph, but all you can see is a shadow of the camera. But it's the latrine inside the castle. This was excavated recently and analyzed, and they discovered substantial and even surprising amounts and varieties of intestinal parasites in the soil. Apparently, the Crusaders were very uncomfortable. So in the year 1191, during the Third Crusade, Richard I of England, that is Richard the Lionheart, captures the island from Isaac Komnenos of Cyprus. Now, Richard had intended to use the island as a major supply base because it was relatively safe from the Saracens. But then a year later, Richard sold the island to the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar is one of two organizations which we're going to have to talk about a little bit because they tend to get a little bit confused. The Knights Templar were a professional body of soldiers that were directly responsible to the Pope, and they were established in the temple at Jerusalem, and that's why they're called Templars. There was another organization called the Knights of St. John's, or the Hospitallers, who were also set up as professional knights directly under the Pope in Jerusalem, but at the hospital in Jerusalem. These knights did not always cooperate 100%, although normally you could count on them. In their day, they were effectively the Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 of the Crusader Kingdom. The way you can tell the difference between the two of them is that the Knights Templar tend to dress in white with red crosses on them, and the Knights of St. John in darker clothes with white crosses on them. This is Colossae Castle behind me. It's near Limassol. The thing that's important about it is that it was where the Knights of St. John set up their headquarters. Now, the Knights of St. John are sometimes called the Hospitallers, and the reason was because in Jerusalem they occupied the hospital. When they were forced out of the Middle East, they fell back to Cyprus, to this location. From here, they fell back to Rhodes, and they became the Knights of Rhodes. And then from Rhodes, they fell back to Malta and became the Knights of Malta. Today, this is basically a vineyard. Almost immediately, the Knights Templar were faced with a bloody revolt, and deciding that holding on to the island was not economic, they sold it to Guy Louis Nain. Now, Guy Louis Nain was king of Jerusalem, but he had lost his kingdom, so he was in search of a new one. And this made a perfect marriage. He became both the king of Jerusalem and the king of Cyprus. They held the island for a couple of hundred years. Then the last Louis IX king died in 1473, leaving the island to his Venetian widow, Queen Catherine Cornwall. In any event, the island is turned over to Venice for administration, and eventually Venice incorporates it into its empire entirely. During these Latin years and the later years of the Byzantine period, the fortifications on the island grew dramatically in order to ward off various kinds of Arab or Muslim raids. Let's go to Nicosia, the capital. You remember it started out just having a watchtower. Well, that pretty quickly becomes a castle, and then a castle surrounded by curtain walls during the Louis IX period. But during the Venetian period, the fortifications really hit their stride because cannons were big. And Venice brought in Star Wars technology, that is, the Star Fort, which was the latest thing in defending cities from cannons. Even today, from the air, you can clearly make out the Star Fort in Nicosia. Now this is the cathedral in Nicosia. This is the place where the king of Cyprus would have been crowned as he took his position. And from here he would go down to Famagusta and be crowned king of Jerusalem as well. It's today not a cathedral, it is a mosque. And this area is prone to earthquakes, and so they've got some glass embedded in the walls there that will break if the blocks start moving apart. The fort at Carigna Castle, retains its Louis IX appearance for the most part, although it has been reinforced by the Venetians to a considerable degree. Nevertheless, it's the Louis IX period that is most important to the stories concerning Carigna Castle. This castle was never taken, and it's in excellent condition. The Turks convinced the garrison to surrender by catapulting the heads of the Venetian commanders of Nicosia over the wall. We're in Carigna Castle, and in Carigna Castle, one of the most interesting stories is about the king's mistress, Joanna. The standard tour of the castle includes the torture chamber, and this is where one of the really good stories of Cyprus come in. It's during the Louis IX period. King Peter I de Louis IX had a mistress. Her name was Joanna la Allemande, Joanna the German. And King Peter was out of town, and the queen was in charge of the castle, Queen Eleanor. And Queen Eleanor had the mistress tortured. Now, Queen Eleanor wasn't torturing the mistress really because she wanted to hurt her quite so much as she wanted Joanna to abort. But Joanna did not abort the baby even under torture. She gave birth to a son, and her son became king eventually because King Peter had no other heirs. In the mountains overlooking Carigna Castle, there are a series of castles. It's probably started out just as watchtowers built by the Byzantines in order to signal back and forth. And they're still close enough that they could signal back and forth, but they each have their own strengths. One of the ones that is most interesting is Saint Hilarion, named after a Christian hermit that was up on this mountain at one time. The castle is substantially built into the mountain and incorporating the mountain in its structure to an incredible extent. As a matter of fact, there is still a Turkish army post at this location. Although it was built over a period of centuries, and much of it is Latin in its architecture. The primary walls were built mostly during the late Byzantine times, as you can see from the red on this plan of the fort. Another rumor that's extremely interesting is that Walt Disney was aware of this particular castle, and he patterned the original designs of Snow White's castle after the Saint Hilarion. This is a drawing, one of the early drawings that Disney was using. The most outstanding piece is a little tower at the very peak of the mountain called Prince John's Tower. It's called that after Prince John of Antioch, who was visiting his relatives here at St. Hilarion when the Queen told him that his guards, which were from Bulgaria, were plotting against him. Prince John took the guards up to the tower and threw them over the side. Of course, the guards weren't plotting against him. The Queen was. Our guide here was a Turkish Cypriot who, as a young man, had actually been in the military posted at this particular castle. And so he was familiar with it from several different angles. One of which was he knew where the barracks were. He knew where he would be imprisoned if he went AWOL, and he did go AWOL. He got very homesick from time to time. And when he got into trouble, he could tell you what kind of punishments would be meted out, and how people were treated, and how they felt about the place.